Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. I'm so glad that you're tuning in today. So, we're going to start in another direction. We had our previous podcast all on stress, not just a 6 letter word. And there's lots of good information that's always relative to just about anything that I talk about because lots of the direction I took in clinical practice had to do with really understanding primitive reflexes and the development of children. Now, there are other podcasts that we've done before that are focused on reflexes that you can certainly go back and really listen to, almost like a review or an outline. But now, what I'd like to do is kind of tie it into what I see in clinical practice and how it might relate to something that your child is going through, or perhaps even you. As I've mentioned before, yes, the majority of my practice is peds, and I love kids. But the percentage of adults that we work with, especially in the area of neurofeedback, when we get to this point in their program where we do a questionnaire, so many things tie back to that individual's earlier years. So especially when we're talking about reflexes, this is something that is part of every human being. It's not just about children. So these reflexes come on, they have a job in the neurology, and then they are going to grow up. But if you have a situation in your life, it could be something mechanical, it could be something emotional, or even chemical that can bring an individual back into their brainstem and have to call back on those reflexes to try to get out of that acute situation and move forward. An example of that, I've shared some things about my mom on the last few podcasts. My mom had a stroke back in the early, like around 2003. And I can remember when I was working on her body that I was massaging her left arm. And literally, when my hands crossed over the palm of her hand literally closed in very tightly, I might add, just like a palmar reflex. So, for the podcast audience, I'm literally showing that I'm putting my fingers in the palm of my hand, and my hand is closing. That's what a baby does when you put your fingers in the palm of their hand. So it's considered a primitive reflex as a baby. But if you're an adult and you have this type of manifestation, it's literally called a pathological reflex. So they have a time frame that they're supposed to occur. They do something, like I said, in the neurology, and then they're meant to inhibit, go quiet, but they are the rudimentary place of all learning. And therefore, if the neurology needs that support again, they're there so that you can rehab, retrain, and move that person back into an expected direction. So I've titled this particular podcast, Hey Mom, I Am Overwhelmed. So many of our little people today have very heightened emotional reactions. And when I had the opportunity to speak to this mom prior to the child coming in, the thing that really captured my attention was mom really did not know what to do because so many of these children are able to do so much. So I don't want to put them in a category that we call high functioning. I think there's too much of that. I've actually learned recently that there's a new term called spectrum diversity, meaning that it's really okay if my kid has autism. It's really okay if my kid has Asperger's. It's really okay if my kid has any other label because everybody's different. I think we're starting to really cross a line that we are going to be expecting that this is okay to have all these problems. I've even had a mom say to me one time, my child has ADD just like every other kid. When we get to the place that we think all of this is okay, we are now in a position that we're numb. Now, I want you to really think about these terms for a second. First of all, there is a lot that is known about autism. And I would tell you at least 99%. I've only had one case where a child was diagnosed autistic at birth. Every other child that I have seen in 28 years was developing as expected, and then somewhere between 15 and 20 months lost everything. There's reasons for that. And the same thing is true over every other label out there. Most of these kids are starting their development as expected. So what happened? Where did the frustration come in? Where did the problems emerge? Many of these things are falling into the category of what is called neuroimmune problems, meaning that some type of illness, some type of imbalance even occurred that was impacting the immune system during a very pivotal time of neurological development. So in this particular case of mom, I'm so overwhelmed, is a young child who is having trouble being directed with many different tasks at one time. So when we look at a child, there are certain milestones that children are expected to acquire at certain ages. And again, we're at another risk because recently, early this year, many of those milestones were changed. And there's really no rhyme or reason for changing them, because you're then falling into that trap that it's okay if you're delayed in this area because they've changed the age of acquiring, therefore you're really okay. And I'm going to really put up some caution flags. Don't buy into that. The earlier we get into these developmental pathways, and especially educating our parents, the faster your child can go in another direction. But when we start having issues and we start taking our child to a variety of places and we don't really get anywhere, or we're told your child will simply outgrow it, I can tell you, I will say 9 times out of 10, no, they will not. Because if you don't change the environment, what will be the trigger to make it change? What was the trigger to get it going in that direction to begin with? So I really want to caution you. If you feel like there is something going on, reach out, even if it's going to be a conversation only. I can at least give you a perspective. I can at least give you resources of information to help you see, where should my child's development actually be? Because once they get to be school age, there's already another layer of stress for them. And as I have mentioned numerous times, children do not have a point of reference. They can't tell you, hey, I can't put both sides of my brain together. So when I do a developmental assessment, I'm looking, can you do what you should be able to do physically by comparing it to developmental milestones? And you can go right on my website, connectmybrain.com. Over under the podcast tab, you can download Dr. Hansen's developmental milestone guidelines. Now, every one of them are not there because you try to condense the document down, but it can at least get you started. And then you can reach out and you can ask questions. We have a fill in sheet right on the website, and you can call the office. I'll give you the phone number at the end of the podcast. So I'm talking to a mom, and she says, I don't know what to do. There is a wonderful community of parents, families, etc., that really do things in a very different direction. They do homeschooling. They're very dynamic in their approaches of how they're getting their kids to socialize and activities. I mean, could you imagine going to even over to Kennesaw Mountain to learn about the battle that was actually fought over there? I remember actually doing that with my now adult son, and we actually planted a tree over at Kennesaw Mountain. And the tangible and the hands on experience, which every classroom, in my opinion, really needs to be revamped because of the way that children learn. Putting them into a seat and expecting them to only look at a board and take this information in, especially if something isn't quite wired as expected. So, in our case of Mom, I'm so overwhelmed, it's not like this child is in the category of gross developmental delay. No, this child can really do many things as expected. So when I had the opportunity to assess, it really wasn't until we got into the movement pieces that would expect the child to be able to cross crawl, that everything then was illuminated. And again, once I share with you how far reaching this particular reflex is, you will understand why the child would be so overwhelmed. But the overwhelmness has now turned into irritability and edgy. Because when you get so frustrated and all you're wanting is somebody else to figure it out and approach you in a way that you can be successful, if a parent doesn't know that, how are they supposed to do it? So the main one that we're going to talk about today, and we've talked about it before, but it's asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. And I'm going to tell you right now, there's never a reflex that's going to continue to be facilitated all by itself. They just don't work that way. When reflexes come on, they come on, and another one comes on a little bit later, and another one comes on a little bit later, and maybe this first one now is dropping off. And so with the way I want you to think about it is like a scaffold, and that there's many layers to it. And if one is still firing, I can tell you right now, the original one is going to join in because it's related to sympathetics. And then even before that is the withdrawal reflexes, and that irritability, edgy, is part of me withdrawing away because by golly, I'm frustrated and nobody is understanding what I'm going through, and nobody's making it easier for me, and nobody's changing how I feel inside. So the one at the very base is withdrawal reflexes. This is our survivability. This is there a potential threat? And if you're sitting there pushing me and pushing me to get me to do something, and I've already demonstrated I am so overwhelmed, I'm just going to pull away. I'm going to reach back down in my brainstem, and I am going to just hold on to that, and I'm going to pull away because I am frustrated. And then Moro comes in, and Moro is all about transition. And Moro is arousal, CO2, O2, and sympathetic nervous system. Okay, we just got done spending weeks on the stress response. This is stress for a child. And if you're going to keep me in that, now I'm in a chronic pattern of stress. And I am just not okay. But where the culprit is that kept it all falling down, those dominoes, just unable to follow a sequence no matter what, happens to be the ATNR. ATNR is when the baby turns its head and that arm and leg reflexively go out. And it's imperative to have that season of time. That particular reflex is going to split us right down the middle. The right side's going to do its work. The left side's going to do its work. You've got lateral columns developing up in the brain. And that is where you have your specialty centers that eventually will communicate, will cross the midline and communicate with each other. In my mom, I'm so overwhelmed case, I think about communication. The need to talk is on the right. The work of talk is on the left. If I'm not firing my midline, then I'm going to look at all conversation as nothing but work, and I'm going to push back, and I'm just going to be irritated. And I am not going to talk, and I am not going to tell you. Or it could be on the other side. I'm going to have emotional breakdowns because this side is firing and I need. So I am going to be overly emotional. On top of it all, when you come into this world, you are more right brain dominant, and that is your emotional quotient. So depending upon which side is firing more, which one is in need more, is going to drive the behavior. Just like when I'm talking to parents and I show them brain maps. When we're talking about kids, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, their maps are based on how did they develop? They're closer to the beginning. What's been going on? If mom didn't know what to do and has tried things for a long period of time, his development was feeling the frustration for a long time. And when I watched the brain map, what I saw was I could not get into alpha. That little person could not get into alpha, the dominant brain wave for his age. And what is that? That's focus calm. That's the ability to be able to sit back and go with the flow. If I can't go with the flow, how do you think I'm going to feel? But the movement piece was so apparent in every single movement assessment that we did. Immediately, he could set himself up correctly, but the minute that you engage momentum and rhythmicity, it was lost. But the interesting part about it, that did not tip his bucket. What has a tendency to tip the bucket was more about how long I had to do something, because that is where the fatigue is coming in for the little person. So what's the other part? Well, the other part for Mom, I'm so overwhelmed is because the eyeballs are not working the way that they're supposed to. So we use a piece of equipment here called right eye, and we're able to diagnostically look at how the eyeballs move. We're going to look at them going in all different kinds of motion. Well, why is that important? Well, you've got 6 muscles that literally wrap around the eyeballs. And those 6 muscles work like a sphincter. And you have other sphincter muscles throughout your body. Swallowing, your bronchi, your intestine, and your rectum, how you eliminate, your colon. So when one group is off, then other groups are off. Neurons that are wired together fire together. So that's another reason why it's so important to be aware of how we get put together and why it is so important to work with somebody that is literally going to look at the entire body and not just one little pocket. Because other things so far reaching will influence other parts of the body. And you may not know that those dots are connected. So when we look at the eye movements, we're able to see if those eyes are moving as expected. And your eyes, when you are born, they have a developmental sequence as well. First of all, when you're born, they work independently. They are the adult size, and your face is going to grow into your eyeballs. They have to learn how to work together, to team. And they do that through resistive sucking that goes on with breastfeeding. Another positive element about breastfeeding. But we'll definitely get into a podcast on breastfeeding and breast milk because it's not that simple, okay? But for this particular podcast, I want to bring that piece into the equation because it is part of the developmental process of how our eyes, those 6 muscles, are eventually going to work for the individual. Now, your visual cortex, or where all this work is going on, is in the back of the brain, which our brain map is also going to pick up information, not only our right eye assessment, but also our brain map. We're going to pull those 2 pieces together so that we can figure out what is the best approach. But the visual cortex is in the back of the brain, and it is going to send information to the front of the brain as well as to the parietal lobe. Now, your parietal lobe is more in the central part of your head, where the frontal is literally behind your forehead. So your visual cortex is sending information to the front. Again, why we know that feedback really does work. Biofeedback, neurofeedback, all kinds of feedback works for the neurology of the human being. So this visual cortex, if its perception is some type of altered movement, the information coming in is also going to be altered. And it's not just about how you see, it's not just visual acuity, it's about the perception of the movement, because we know that the movements, which are called pursuits and saccades, have different input to the brain. So pursuits are slow movements and saccades are fast movements. So everything that you know about how the frontal lobe works, like your executive function, your ability to put thoughts together, is also influenced by how you see it. And let me put that how in quotes, underline it, make it bold. So now let's go back to our little mom, I'm so overwhelmed case. If I'm frustrated, if I'm edgy, if you're sending all kinds of information to me, do this, do this, do this, and I'm like, stop, I'm overwhelmed. You have your mind's eye. What do you think that child might be going through as the information's coming in, rapid fire and machine gun? I'm trying to put some mental imagery together, and before you know it, it's all distorted, and I'm really frustrated. But again, it's feedback, it's going back and forth. So it's not only coming out in a behavior. I hate that word, because these are not kids having behavior issues. These are kids that are demonstrating things because something faulty is going on, and I need somebody to understand it. I need somebody to figure it out, because I don't know how to do it for myself. And the one thing that we found on that particular right eye assessment was the saccades, which is fast eye movements, and it has a lot to do with emotional balance. Well, okay, let's go back. Let's go back to our movement piece for a minute. Let's put it together. So I definitely still have an ATNR firing. My body is still acting like it's separated right down the middle. ATNR is also about near far vision. So when that little baby, so make sure you go over and look at the video, but when that little baby is little and this reflex is supposed to be active, that baby is still in a little flexed position, but every time it turns its head, its arm and leg go out on that side. So I've got my fists up to my face, and so that's near vision. I'm looking at my hand. But then when I turn and my arm goes out, I'm got far vision. I'm looking out there. So it's part of how the vision gets wired up. When I did my writing sample on this little person, the posture was literally an ATNR posture. He had his head supported on his hand as he was writing. So why would he do that? Because he's trying to shorten up his body. Because his body, when his head turns, it wants to go out. He's trying to control his head movement so he can keep his hand controlled on the paper. I saw another reflex during his writing. He literally got his whole little body flexed up, and he was pulling his knees towards his chest as his head was going down towards the desk. That's a TLR, a tonic labyrinthine reflex. Then, when we do our writing sample, they get an instruction to write me something all across the page. And when these kids are having trouble with their eyeballs, and again, there's two parts to our vision. One is visual acuity, about the lens of the eye. The other one is oculomotor, how the muscles wrap around the eyes and move them around. When he did his writing sample, after being given the instruction of writing across the page, he wrote only on the left-hand side. So he's literally now absent to the right side because his eyes cannot cross that midline with ease. Another indicator for ATNR. Wow. So I hope what you've gathered, how important it is to understand development. Don't wait. If you have any inclination that your child is frustrated, maybe it is a pulling away, maybe it's an emotional breakdown. It's never one over the other. And it's not a guarantee that even a child having the same things would have meltdowns. They may just pull away. This can't be healthcare by conveyor belt. These are not just recipes. You have to do a developmental assessment so that you can pinpoint what it is. This little person had lots of positive, completed developmental maturations, but this one thing is really keeping him from going forward. And now what is manifesting is emotional frustration. And that's hard. That's very hard on a little person. And the longer it goes on, well, go back and listen to the podcasts on stress. You end up really giving away great development that happened in the brain, because number one thing that brain is going to do is it's going to keep you alive. And so if you're perpetuating a chronic stress pattern, even if you don't know it, even if you're a little person and somebody else has got to figure this out, all those good things can get diverted in a negative direction, and we don't want that. And we can figure it out, and we can shift it. It's not hard to do. So, to wrap it up, make sure if you got something going on, you're really wondering, all you have to do is reach out. Send me a question. If you want to chat, tell me when you're available so that we can really minimize the back and forth in scheduling. If you want your child to have a stress test to see if they're under stress, if you want your child to have a developmental assessment, Connect My Brain is the place to go. Give us a call, 678-501-5172. And as always, thanks for tuning in and be blessed.